Hello, listener, and welcome to Fighting Failure, the podcast where we discuss solutions to the climate crisis. This is episode 3, all about global supply chains. I'm your host for this episode, Oscar Archibald.
I'm your co-host, Hisham Kanan.
And I'm your other co-host, Sonia Stapleton.
So in this episode, we will talking about global supply chains, the problems they have, and how those problems can be fixed, all, of course, in relation to climate change and carbon dioxide emissions. So we are looking at an image from Our World in Data, and it's got loads of statistics to tell us.
I think in previous episodes, we've also looked at this same data set. And right now, what's important for this episode is everyone should know that road freight accounts for 29.4% of emissions, and shipping accounts for 10.6% of emissions.
Also, freight planes make up 20% of emissions from planes, which is 2% of overall transport emissions. This is important to bear in mind because freight planes generally use older planes, which are less fuel efficient. Rail travel makes up 1% of transport emissions. This is a mixture of freight trains and passenger trains. I'm not sure, but if I were to guess, I would say it's probably about half freight to passenger. However, I could be wrong. If you have a correction to make, you can go to anchor.fm/fightingfailure and send us a voice message, and you could be featured in a future episode. Finally, before we move on to the problems that we have with global supply chains, pipelines, which could be supplying, it says here, oil, gas, water, steam, and other materials, make up about 2% of emissions from supply chains. This image will, of course, not from supply chains, from transportation. This image will, of course, be in the show notes if you want to check it out for yourself. Now we're going to talk about the issues with global supply chains.
Most, if not all, of these methods of transportation and shipping are not sustainable. They create carbon emissions and however, they're often very efficient to maximize profits.
Yeah, of course, fuel is a fixed cost and it is quite expensive. Of course, prices do fluctuate. However, for anyone in the industry, maximizing efficiency is key to maximizing profit. So this doesn't necessarily mean that they're optimizing to have the least carbon emissions, but they're optimizing to spend the least money on fuel. This does mean, as we will talk about later in this episode, that ships often use a dirtier form of oil because it's cheaper, but it is good to note that they are trying to be fuel efficient just to maximize profits.
There also aren't robust climate targets in place because it's a multinational sector.
Because, of course, it is transportation of goods and materials between countries, it's very difficult to put legislation on that because it's traversing international airspace or international waters, and of course that is much more difficult to regulate.
There's also an increasing demand for fast shipping, which requires planes. Now, people are so used to having, overnight shipping, and that is terrible for the environment. When you have overnight shipping, your, boxes or packages or whatever you're trying to get, those are coming in through planes. That is going to cause so much emissions, and it's just really bad.
Exactly.
Yeah, and further, the industry is growing, so this is increasing the demand for overnight shipping, and for, you want your Amazon package to come ASAP so you don't miss your sister's birthday present, but, is that really better? Because that's just telling them, we need to buy more planes, we need to use more planes, we need to send off this plane ASAP, and so that's just more and more emissions. It's ridiculous, and that's something which has to be kept in mind. Is it stay local is a very, very common concept worldwide, and I think that's important to keep in mind when you're shopping. In Malawi, it's very hard, right? It's hard to both order things because of the expense of shipping, and it's hard to find stuff locally, but it's, I think that, in the US and Europe, there's no excuse to not go to a store to buy whatever presents you need, whatever food you need, rather than ordering it. And I know a lot of people here from the US Embassy who have free shipping take advantage of that significantly, and they'll order food, they'll order presents and monthly orders, and that's also large distances. So ordering, from far from the headquarters is even worse than ordering close to the headquarters, but that's not really something that you can control, is it? So
Yeah, I mean, Chipiku isn't too bad if you want groceries, but yeah, having lived in Malawi, I do completely understand the need for Amazon. There isn't really the same in the UK.
In Malawi, you kind of sustainably farmed meat, and you can get vegetables, and you can get all the grocery necessities, but it's hard to get kind of more leisure things. And I think we can do without a certain amount of leisure purchases. But there's always, like, if you can, it's always, more, it makes your life that much more exciting to like get a present on your birthday, right? So it is, you always end up shipping, or yeah. So I guess it's just that there's some sort of need.
Why do I feel like you're talking about yourself with this Amazon story?
The thing is, I'm not embassy, right? So I can't, we don't get free shipments. So we've done 2 shipments to move our objects to Malawi. So the stuff we need, beds, couches, furniture, all the plates and glasses and everything we need to actually live here without having to buy more stuff and increase demand on those items. And also we've done one Apex to bring presents here. However, when we're in the US, we buy presents and then we bring it back with us via the plane, which is far more efficient if you think about it than ordering a separate Apex to come. There's far more efficient ways to bring back items than shipment.
Could you clarify for me what Apex is?
Apex is just a shipping service which enables you to bring items overseas.
My dad works in foreign development, and so that's why I've lived in both Malawi and Sri Lanka. When we lived in Sri Lanka, he was working for the High Commission, the Australian High Commission specifically, and and then in Malawi he worked for UNICEF, which is the United Nations, which is, I guess, not embassy really. So it's really interesting to see how different it is, the experience when you're working with an embassy and without. When we moved to Sri Lanka, our shipping container full of our stuff, like you said, was all moved by air, and it arrived within a week or so in Sri Lanka. And while we were waiting for our stuff to arrive, we got to stay in a top-class hotel. Whenever we flied back to Australia, we got to go in business class. And then when we were with the UN in Malawi, our container came by ship, which took many months, but is of course much more carbon friendly. It came by ship, and whenever we flew, we had to pay for it with our own money, and of course we went by economy class. And the UN only paid, I think maybe it was a quarter of the school fees rather than all the school fees. It was interesting to see the disparity, but I guess it's important to remember that we completely managed to live for a couple of months while we waited for our shipping to arrive by ship, just off what we had in our suitcases, and I think it's important to reduce our need for this really fast shipping.
Yeah, and I'm doing that now. I'm waiting for my stuff to come over ship.
And in fact, Sadia's embassy, so that's kind of shocking that she's waiting for that long, but...
No, it's not, actually, Hisham. Most US embassy people wait for that long.
Yes, that's what I was gonna say is that it's because it's so hard to get things overseas, and we only, if your parents are working in development or aid overseas with like USAID or the embassy, then it's overseas it's far harder to get anything than in the US. That's such a like industrial country, and all through Europe it's so industrial that it's so easy to get stuff to come in a day, in a week.
In Malawi, we used like the Amazon, and we took advantage of our shipping, so we could shipping overseas. So we got stuff in 2 weeks maybe. But in India, we're taking advantage of the local stuff. So we have now we have access to a whole load of restaurants, shops around us, and we're using that instead of taking advantage of shipping.
Tell Jaden if he wants to get cubes in India, there's a store called Cube Lelo to get cubes in India rather than getting them from overseas on Amazon.
I'm bored right now because the Wi-Fi is kicking me off. This annoying.
As we've just talked about how the industry is growing, another problem is what we do with ships that are sort of reaching the end of their life. From what I've read from articles, they're often not scrapped in a sustainable way. So we talked earlier about how ships are being more fuel efficient because of profits, but also driven by profits is the desire of companies to scrap their ships to get the most money as possible, and this often leads them.
Okay, let's see if I can join back on.
To sell their ships to shipbreaking yards in India, which are not run sustainably and release a lot of harmful chemicals into the ocean at these beaching yards, which is really not good, I guess.
And you have that with airplanes too.
Come on. Okay, there we go.
Not maybe in India, but you have airplane graveyards and stuff.
Yeah, I guess the problem that we're having with ships more than airplanes is that ships are just beached on the beach. which means that when they're taken apart, these chemicals are just flowing straight back out into the sea, whereas an airplane graveyard is, I guess, on concrete on land. These shipping graveyards just aren't sustainable at all. We'll be talking about that later as well. We actually just recorded episode 5, even though that came out just after episode 1, but we talked about how there just aren't enough railways and they aren't electrified, but I guess we won't expand on that right here. You can go listen to episode 5 if you want to hear about railways and their electrification.
I think that though ships are so much more carbon efficient, the way that they, Sandio will touch on this in the conservation section. Ships, they pollute the ocean so much, it's not only plastic pollution, that has to be kept in mind. Though plastic pollution is a huge problem which, sea life faces, there's also, oil spills and all that, it's just diminishing the natural ecosystems in the oceans and in lakes. And it's really horrible to see the decline in, I've been scuba diving in some places where the coral reefs are grayish, and that's really depressing to see because that's when the coral reefs are dying from pollution. And I've been scuba diving where the coral reefs are completely fantastic colors, and that it's just the contrast between the two. It's just so shocking, and I think that that has to be kept in mind. Are ships necessarily better for the environment and for the ecosystems?
Yeah, as always, it's important to remember that ships are. I would say ships are better than planes, but as we talked about in EVs, no EV. An EV is good, but there's nothing better than nothing. If we don't need to order everything coming from China all the time, and instead we can just not need as many stuff. That's not a very good sentence, but if we don't want as much stuff and it doesn't have to be shipped, that's always better than... It's better to not get something shipped at all than to ship it with the slow sea shipping, of course, because, I'm from Cairns, and that's next to the Great Barrier Reef, which is a huge, beautiful coral reef, but it's really being destroyed by lots of different factors of human action, which is very sad, because it was nice. I never actually, remember being in Cairns, but still. Moving on from railways and ships, I want to talk about a bit about trucks. I don't have complete proof, but I have reason to believe that trucks in the United States do not have robust emission standards like they do in the EU. # Europe does it better. And it's also really interesting to see the difference in truck design between Europe and the US. I'm just going to do a quick Google search and look up American truck. If you guys could potentially do that too, you'll see that it's got this design where you've got the cab, and then there's this sort of very long, maybe not cylindrical, but sort of rectangular prism sort of engine coming out all the way from the cab, which has a big grille in front, and then behind the cab, you've also got 2 long exhaust pipes, and then a bit, maybe that's a sleeping cabin. However, if you then look up European truck, and this is the sort that we have in the UK as well, you will see that it has a completely flat face, with a grille right beneath the cab, and then just behind where the driver sits, you're already starting to have, the part that delivers the truck. What do you call it? The freight bit. And so it's also really interesting to see this huge difference. And it makes me think that this American truck has a very big engine and potentially emits more than these more modern European trucks. They just look much older than them. I'm also going to look up Australian trucks, because when I went to Australia, I noticed that the trucks look really different compared to the European trucks. Yeah, so the Australian trucks also seem to be very much like the American trucks in that they're very big and emitting compared to the nicer European trucks. Yeah, I'll see if I can find a stat and I'll put that in the show notes. Something about emission standards for trucks in the UK versus the US. But that was just interesting to see. And it's important to remember that trucks aren't really very efficient. Trucks aren't very efficient because there's this one what do you call it? Is it called a tractor? The bit that drives the truck at the front? And this is pulling probably the equivalent of 1 shipping container worth of goods for each tractor. However, 1 locomotive, while it uses more energy than a tractor, could pull 50 shipping containers along a railway. So trucks aren't nearly as efficient as trains. In right here, where there's a train line quite near to my house, and we often see freight trains on there that just go on forever. I'd say probably about 50 shipping containers with one locomotive. But I guess the trade-off then is that trucks are very precise, and they can, you could probably get a truck coming right down our street, but you can't have a train going down our street. Trucks can go places where trains can't. Yeah, so that's a problem, isn't it? Because trucks are more useful but less efficient. So those are all the problems I could think of when I was writing these show notes. If you have any others, you can just tweet at us at FightingFailPod, or go to anchor.fm/fightingfailure and leave us a voice message. Now we're going to talk about the solutions to these problems. So we said that all of these methods are not really sustainable and create carbon emissions. So I want to really discuss these solutions for each different aspect of the global supply chain. So trucks, trains, planes, that sort of ships as well. I wanted to talk about those individually because, of course, they all require different solutions. So let's start with trucks. I think this requires a two-pronged approach. Hydrogen is better for long-distance journeys, so this could be used for longer trucking routes. However, I also think that longer trucking routes should be replaced by trains. Anyway, hydrogen filling up places, so I guess gas stations accept literal gas and not liquid gas. Honestly, why do Americans... It's gasoline, isn't it? But it's a very confusing name. So you could have literal hydrogen gas, although it would probably be liquefied anyway. Placed along popular trucking routes so they can get the most use. So if you place them along highways, they're inevitably going to be more widely used and therefore have a greater potential for breaking even if they're placed where there's lots of trucks. So this is really interesting, but Nikola, which is this sort of new startup company that has been involved in quite a few scandals about lying about their things, but it does have an interesting business model. They want to lease their hydrogen trucks in a way so that with all expenses included, including maintenance, so that it just undercuts the price of a diesel truck. So it might be a bad, scandalous company, but they do have a promising business model that maybe could be adopted by a more ethically conscious business. Also, I've been watching quite a few videos about electric and hydrogen trucks versus diesel trucks, and one big problem is that trucks, at least in the US, I don't know what it is in Europe or anywhere else. I assume it's similar. To protect the roads, you need to have a limit on how heavy a truck can be. But the problem is batteries, of course, are very heavy, and this means that diesel trucks are able to carry more payload because they're carrying less battery, or they're carrying no battery. And this is a problem because it means that diesel trucks can be more profitable since they can carry more cargo, which of course is what pays the bills. So I was thinking that maybe governments could raise limits on the tonnage for renewable powered trucks to allow, basically, say that electric trucks and hydrogen trucks can be heavier because this would allow them to carry the same amount of payload and therefore compete with non-renewable trucks. If this is a concern for the roads, then you could also say diesel trucks are allowed less tonnage just to equalize that, to basically make a level playing field between diesel trucks and renewable trucks in terms of how much cargo they can carry. I think that would really, really boost the industry. So I talked about the two-pronged approach. So the first prong is, of course, hydrogen. The other prong is electricity. So this could be used for shorter trucking routes. I'm thinking about delivery from distribution centers to retailers. For example, if you want to get beer from your distribution center to your local pubs. It might sound a bit overkill to use a truck rather than just a van to deliver beer to pubs, but on my route to school, I often see a proper big European truck to just deliver kegs of beer to a local pub. Maybe if you're getting Amazon orders from the distribution center to your house, you're getting retail items to retail stores, or food from distribution centers to supermarkets. These are all great reasons to use an electric car because it's much more efficient at shorter distances. I guess in general that's just intra-city travel. Intra being within, rather than inter, which is between, if you know your Latin, which I do. As always, it's important to have government initiatives to make electric and hydrogen vehicles a plausible option for the trucking sector. So the next portion of the global supply chain I wanted to talk about was freight planes. Again, this requires a two-pronged approach, like a meat fork. You know, the meat forks which have two prongs? Brooklyn Nine-Nine reference.
Yeah.
Planes have an easy, much more carbon-efficient alternative, ships. However, this has a downside, speed. Of course, there's always, I guess, a trade-off. Who put the washing machine on while I'm recording a podcast? For God's sake.
You've got to keep that in the original one, in the final product, Oscar.
We need to reduce demand for overnight shipping to make it much better for the environment. This, of course, includes government incentives Honestly, one day I should tally up every time I've said government incentives in all of these podcasts.
It'll be 100.
I know it's like an obsession. It's an obsession. It's brought up in every episode. Government incentives, but in truth, that is one of the best ways to promote, such alternatives.
So I was thinking maybe the government could reduce tax on slower delivery, or increase tax on faster delivery. I guess that this sort of all ties into the sort of carbon tax and the negative externality tax. Also, there's this also mental thing, is to make, for example, when you go to Amazon, the default option for delivery that's clicked should be the slowest one or the most eco-friendly one. That should be the primary option. I guess in general, what you want with climate change is that the climate solution is opt out, not opt in. So, for example, say when I have school lunch, I'm quite lucky to have hot lunch made for me at school that we just go and pick up rather than having to bring something from home. And there's usually like 2 options to have meat and 1 option for vegetable.
I was just wondering, are you insulting your parents' cooking? Like, oh, I'm so lucky I can eat at the school.
Yes, I am insulting my parents' cooking.
Uh,
No, we have really good dinners at home, but the lunches are really bad because it's always just like a wrap with something, and it's like, oh my gosh, so boring.
yeah, it gets too repetitive.
Exactly, too repetitive. So anyway, if you have these 2 meat options and 1 vegetable option, and the meat option is the closest to you, you'll think, okay, I'll have the meat. But if there's 2 vegetable options at the front and then a small meat option, you'd think the vegetable option is sort of opt out rather than opt in. Not, can I have the vegetarian? It's more, can I have the meat, please? Or can I just have this main meal, which is vegetarian or not containing beef?
Yeah.
So just in general is this idea of that maybe the default energy supplier is renewable and you could opt out of that. Just in general, you'll be surprised how often people just accept the defaults. And if the default is climate friendly, then that can be really good. The other prong of my meat fork approach to freight planes, yeah, that's right, is this problem that we talked about, where the freight planes are converted older models that are far less fuel efficient. So there's again a compromise here. If they're upgraded, then this would improve fuel efficiency, but it would cause increased emissions because they're creating a new plane and scrapping an old one.
Yeah.
And it's also good that there's this donut economy with the planes to some extent, that the planes that are no longer in passenger service are converted to freight planes. And it's great to see that they're having a new life for these planes, but they create more emissions.
I was just saying, yeah, that's great because it prevents waste. It prevents, plane waste. That's huge because how the size of a lot of the planes, which are used for freight, which could be used for freight, and which are used for international flights, for example. Those huge planes. Imagine that going to waste. That's a very, very big loss, and then having to replace that with another one, that's just, it's not an efficient approach.
Just unfortunately, these older planes create more emissions because of their old engines. However, I have an ingenious solution. If we keep the old planes, but we give them new engines, then this will both limit waste because we're not replacing an entire plane, and improve fuel efficiency because we have a much newer engine. Maybe we could put the old engines in a museum as well instead of landfill. However, I'm really not completely sure how feasible this is. I know that the 737 MAX was a bit of a disaster because they were putting these huge new engines on a plane that used to have smaller old engines, and this caused some issues. But could we get newer versions of the smaller engines? I'm not sure how feasible it is, but I think it would definitely be worth looking into it, because it would also benefit the companies because they're paying less on fuel. The next section of the global supply chain I wanted to talk about was shipping.
Shipping is a huge industry, and ships are very fuel efficient in comparison to planes and trucks. However, this profits increase when fuel costs go down, and thus shipping companies do all they can to limit fuel usage, right? However, it must be kept in account that ships do put out large emissions into the ocean, and that's killing off the ecosystems, kind of. weaning them out.
Another problem is that ships often use unrefined fuels. So if you know about how oil works, at the very bottom you've got these stuff like tar and bitumen, which is used for making roads. Then you go up and you've got these very heavy fuels like diesel, and then you move up and you've got petrol, and then you've got lighter fuels like kerosene, paraffin, and those sort of things. However, ships often use these fuels at the very bottom of the spectrum that haven't been refined very much, and these create a huge amount of emissions that they really wouldn't have to. But they're also much cheaper because they don't go through the same refining process. Now, due to economics and capitalism, the only way to really limit this is to illegalize unrefined fuels, such as those used on ships internationally, because ships generally follow the laws of the country of registration, which tends to be Panama or the Bahamas or somewhere that has lax labor regulations which allow the shipping company to minimize labor costs. Anyway, apart from that sort of cheating the system, this is why we need international rules to illegalize these unrefined fuels, because we can seriously reduce emissions from ships just by using a more refined sort of fuel. That's all we need to do.
It's hard for governments of less fortunate countries to minimize that, because it's a very hard shift for their people to make, and the companies based out of their country to make. Like, thinking about, just for example, Malawi, I don't think that there's any shipping companies out of Malawi, because of course Malawi is landlocked. We have a large lake, but we don't have any ocean. However, imagine there was a shipping company out of Malawi. It's not feasible to have more refined fuels, because the companies would have such little income, basically, that they wouldn't be able to pay for they wouldn't be able to pay any more than unrefined fuels and cheap old ships. And it's hard to build yourself up to that point where that shift is easy to make.
I completely agree, and this is, of course, why we need international regulations. But as with anything, it does require, it's not going to be easy, and we do have to sort of make these sacrifices, and that is, of course, harder for developing nations. So I'm imagining multiple ways that ships could decarbonize. So I was writing this a couple nights ago. Yeah. Hydrogen. So I haven't really researched this deeply, but as we know, hydrogen is a great fuel for long distance travel due to its high energy density. We'll talk about that next episode on hydrogen. So I haven't really talked about this greatly, but hydrogen has a low spatial density, which means it doesn't have much energy for the amount of space, but it does have a high energy density for its mass. On ships, space isn't as much of a problem as it is on planes or cars, so hydrogen could work. And ships are really huge, so they could potentially produce their own hydrogen on board through electrolysis. However, this requires a lot of electricity. But if you had the electricity to make hydrogen, why don't you just use that to power the motors? Because you lose quite a bit of energy creating hydrogen. Okay, yeah, never mind. Don't produce your own hydrogen, that's stupid. Unless you have solar. But yeah, if there was any way to create green hydrogen on a ship, you could just use that electricity and use that straight away rather than making hydrogen. Okay. Unless you want to use it, of course, as energy storage for overnight if you're having solar panels or something. Electricity. So there are quite a few prototypes and real ships that are battery powered, and some are self-driving as well, or have potential to be self-driving, which is a good idea in ships, because unlike on the road where you have to be precise to the centimeter or die, in the open ocean, accuracy is less of an issue until you get to a port. And many parts of the shipping industry, such as docks, is a good example, are becoming more automated. This could streamline the shipping industry and increase efficiency for companies involved. Now, I did some research, and the ship with the biggest battery capacity is the Stena Jutlandica. I'm assuming the J is some sort of, goes as a Y, like it does in many European languages. Maybe it's Jutlandica, it doesn't sound right. Anyway, with a capacity of a whopping 50,000 kilowatt hours. I don't believe that this is currently in service yet, but it's great to see that Stena Line, the company behind this, is investing in battery technology like this. And I've actually been on a Stena Line ship, and it's really nice. However, Phoebe hates it because they wake you up at 5 a.m. with bird noises, and she thinks it's horrible. But anyway, as you might guess, battery capacity is what will be holding ships back, as they often go for many weeks without charging or refueling out in the open ocean. I don't think there's going to be a Tesla supercharger station
in the middle of the ocean. Yeah.
Oh look, it's a floating Tesla station.
Back in the olden days, there was no steamships or diesel monstrosities. Everything was done with a good old sailing ship. So
I myself have sailed. It's not much smaller ship. It's probably a 1 or 2 man dinghy. When I say dinghy, I don't mean like these rubber inflatable things. I'll put a link in the description. But a dinghy sailing is you've got This is a pretty accurate representation. It's a small boat. It says often carried by vessel for use as a light boat or tender, but when we're sailing it, it's got a big sail, which is called the mainsail. You've also got a jib at the front to catch some of the wind, and if you want a bigger sail, you can also raise the spinnaker. So I've sailed a bit. It's awesome fun. Can I just tell you how much fun it is when you are not putting in physical effort? It's not like rowing where you have to go push. I also do a lot of rowing. You're just being carried by the wind, racing across the ocean, and when a gust of wind picks up and the boat starts to tip on its side and you lean out of the boat and you're sailing away, it's so much fun. The wind is pushing you.
Yeah. And the water sprays up on your face, and it's just an amazing...
No, the water doesn't spray up on your face, but it is an amazing feeling. I'm not going that fast.
Yeah, it does. Okay, I've been on a small one, and the water sprayed on me. And when the wind picked up, we almost tipped, and we had to crawl under to the other side. But it's such an amazing experience to just you feel like it's much more like being out in nature than rather taking, a motorboat. On a motorboat, you feel like you have control, but it's not that kind of experience with nature. It's just a kind of experience for yourself.
I so agree. It's such a beautiful experience. The way that it's sailed.
Sails do take up a lot of space. However, there is a new technology in the form of a vertical sail. So this is a rotating sail that takes up a small amount of space but can create a lot of energy. It's a well-known technology, and it uses the Magnus effect. There are quite a few examples of large ships using this technology, even from, I don't know how to pronounce this word, Maersk, one of the largest shipping companies. So sails could be used in tandem with batteries to propel a ship.
Yeah, and I guess the last option is nuclear. So we do have nuclear submarines, but of course there's a lot of problems with this, which is why I don't think it'll be viable. The difficulty of installing nuclear reactors, the difficulty of dealing with nuclear waste. But of course, one of the main advantages with nuclear is how long it lasts. A lot of our probes go exploring outer space use a RTG, a radioactive thermal generator or something. I'll put a link to that in the show notes. But it's about how they're using nuclear power to allow their robots to stay on all the planets for a long time. And the reason for this is, of course, if you'll remember, I think it was the Opportunity rover that had served for a long time on Mars, but then its solar panels got covered in a dust storm, and then it couldn't be reached, and it didn't have any way to take the dust off its solar panels. So nuclear reactors sort of avoid this problem and allow for constant generation of power.
Then, considering the nuclear waste, how much better is that for the ecosystems, in the ocean, and how much better is that for the people manning those ships, so then there's all these issues with it, it's not that feasible, but it is something that could be considered in some scenarios.
So, as with many things, it's important to remember that reducing demand for a type of transportation will reduce emissions from that sector. While shipping is currently the most eco-friendly way of transporting goods across the ocean, let's be honest, a rowing boat isn't going to cut it. Not shipping anything across the world at all is better. We need to reduce demand for products from China that you don't really need. Delay that iPhone upgrade until next year. This will be explored in further depth in our series on consumerism, coming in the future. Be sure to stay tuned.
And I just wanted to also state that, this is a similar thing, these alternate shipping methods, even if they did come into to primary use, they're still not the silver bullet. It's still the same as the EVs, they're not gonna, perfect the planet. They're not gonna make they're gonna make some change. They're gonna reduce the amount of emissions, from that sector, but it's not gonna really, what's it worth, just trying to reduce that is far better. Just like, it's better to have no car than to have a car, which is something we discussed a lot in our first episode on electric vehicles. And if you haven't seen that, just go back to that episode and rewatch that, because we cover a lot in that episode.
So we also talked, moving on from, I guess, decarbonizing these different parts of the shipping and global supply chain industry, we also talked about how there aren't robust climate targets in place because it is a multinational sector. So you all know I love government initiatives, so government initiatives, UN treaties, yada, 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 yada. We also need to put pressure on shipping lines like Maersk. I really don't know how to say that. Maybe let's find another shipping line and say that instead. Big shipping companies. Yeah, come on, it shouldn't be this hard. Oh yeah, of course, MSC, Costco, those sort of ones. I'll just say Costco, but I don't mean Costco, you know. Anyway, so we need to put pressure on big shipping companies like Costco and MSC to enact climate targets and reduce their emissions.
Yeah.
I'm not exactly sure how we want to do this, but as always, maybe boycotting, that sort of thing is always a good step to take, as well as public pressure. So if you're listening to this and you have a decent number of followers on Twitter, maybe tag Maersk and ask them to have some more robust climate targets. We also talked about this increasing demand for fast shipping. And also we mentioned earlier that we need taxes on fast delivery, tax relief on slow delivery, and as we've talked about a bajillion times, reducing demand is always the best way to go. If we don't need something to be shipped at all, that's what we want to do. So when you're going to check out on Amazon, think, do I really need these silicone wall stickers with pictures of birds? Do I really need a glow-in-the-dark cat to stick above my lamp switch? Or could I just cut something out of some local FSC certified paper and stick that up instead? That's always what we want to think about is, do I need this gadget?
And I think that's just another, again, pointing out, keep things local, go to a local store and rather buy something from there. If you really want something that bad, just, I could drop into Chipiku and buy like a doll with a freaky shaped head. And that's better than me buying a doll from Amazon and having it shipped here, right? So, there's always an alternate, there's always an alternative. So just keep that in mind.
When my cousins from Australia came to visit Malawi, they called it Cheeky Poo. And of course, that's this idea of reducing consumerism and taxes is also a solution to the problem of, as we talked about, the growing industry. So, and the next big topic that's really important I wanted to talk about was that ships which are no longer used are not dealt with or scrapped, I guess, in a sustainable way. This is a huge problem, not just in the field of environment and climate change, but also in the field of human rights. So I'll link to this really interesting article by BBC. It's called Breaking Bad, which talks about these shipbreaking yards in India that are bad in very many ways. So what I thought was really interesting to see is how well these ships are being recycled, in that every part is being used, nothing's being thrown to landfill, the steel is being sold off. I saw that you can buy light bulbs from ships in the local stores. And while it is great to see that everything is being recycled and not sent to landfill, there are terrible implications for the local environment in India, because they're not being recycled in a dry dock. They're just being beached, these tidal flats, and then just taken apart from there. And this means that all manner of dangerous and hazardous chemicals are being released into the environment. And studies have shown that there's a very high level of dangerous chemicals in the sand. And actually, if you pick up a sample of the sand at that beach, half of it will be made of metal, which is really bad. And there's also even worse is there are terrible conditions for the workers who are living and working there. They're working long hours with little to no safety equipment. They've got hard hats, but they don't have masks when they're drilling into things that are releasing a lot of dangerous fumes. Many of them have suffered cuts. They're climbing up the anchor chain of a ship with no climbing equipment at all. It is so dangerous and so horrible for the workers there.
And it's not just the conditions, but a lot of these workers, they're doing this job. Of course they're doing it for the money, and they're not even getting paid, fair wages for fair salaries, right? And they have to sustain, most of these people, they have families they have to go home to, they have to provide food, and they have to, provide money for children's schooling, and it's not that possible with the income that they get from doing these dangerous jobs. So that has to be kept in mind, of course.
I guess the solution for this is we need to ensure, and this is happening to some extent, that shipbreaking yards are compliant with EU regulations. Europe has very stringent regulations for breaking apart ships in a sustainable and environmentally friendly way, as well as in a way that protects workers. This is, of course, mentioned on the BBC article, is that in Europe, the workers have to... workers are given face masks and fire-resistant overalls and all manner of safety equipment, as well as decent wages, and the ships are broken apart in a dry dock, which means that the dangerous metals are not released into the environment. Exactly. And it's good to see that there are many shipbreaking yards that are applying for EU certification, which means that there's a lot of rules as well which mandate that companies use EU-regulated shipbreaking yards, but of course, profit-driven oil companies are trying to find loopholes to avoid that. moving on, we talked about how not enough railways exist and they aren't really electrified. So railways, unlike many new sustainable technologies, are something we know how to do, and we know how to do them sustainably. This, of course, does require a green grid, and existing railway lines need to be electrified. New rail connections need to be created, and we need to expand existing railway networks. And I think something that's important to keep in mind is we need an emphasis on widespread train tracks rather than high-speed train tracks, especially for freight. HS2. So the next thing we talked about was that trucks in the United States don't have robust emission standards as they do in the EU. So I have reason to believe that the more modern looking trucks are more energy efficient and more emission efficient, if that's a thing people say. I believe in the EU the standard is the Euro 6 sort of engine standard in terms of emissions and efficiency. We need government initiatives, perhaps a trade-in scheme so that you can get a guaranteed price for your truck to go towards a new truck, or just what they do in the EU, which is strict rules that your truck cannot be on the road if it doesn't meet a certain emission standards. This, of course, could be very devastating to the US truck industry, so it will be up to Joe Biden and his team to see how they want to roll in these sort of new standards in a way that works for the industry as well, because we don't necessarily want to collapse the entire United States transportation system.
Yeah, and it's also not just getting, more efficient trucks, also there has to be some sort of, money going into, buying trucks which are entirely trucks that are run on electricity, like, we touched on this in the electric vehicles episode, so go back and watch that if you haven't. And it's very important to try and electrify things which are run primarily on diesel and petrol and other gases, because that's, even though it's not a silver bullet, it reduces emissions, far better than a lot of other options. So that should be considered and taken into account.
Yeah, exactly. So the last thing I wanted to talk about is how we said trucks are very efficient, but they are quite precise. So what we need to do is, first of all, we need to have rail lines that are, there's a lot of rail lines, so maybe every major town. So, in the UK, I'd say we should at least, and I think this probably exists, have a rail line to every county town. So Oxford is the capital of Oxfordshire, the county town, I think, is the word. So every county town at least should have a railway line, because I think an electric truck can go from the county town to anywhere else in the county. We need to make sure that an electric truck can get from the rail station to anywhere it could need to deliver to. Because otherwise, electric trucks have a relatively short range. So as long as electric trucks can make the last mile from the train station to the delivery centre, that's how many trains we need. So, welcome to Fighting Failure Article Club. This week we're going to be talking maybe a bit more in depth about the Breaking Bad article that we mentioned above. Of course, a link in the description, and let's get started. So I haven't really written much, unfortunately, in the show notes, but first of all were the environmental issues that the problems with these shipyards.
I mean, we've mentioned this many times already in this episode, so I don't want to have to bore everyone, but, of course, there's toxins being released into the ocean, in these coastal shipyards, and that's being released into the ocean, that's harming, reefs, and that's harming the animals, and it's just as bad as plastic pollution in the ocean. It's commonly overlooked. People don't really think that their boat is going to affect the environment. They think that they're plastic, so that people reduce plastic, which is a great thing to do, but also, reducing the amount of boat usage, and so that's also comes in, into shipping, of course, and shipping, although it's far, far more efficient in terms of like emissions into the atmosphere than planes and trucks, etc., there are always going to be downsides, and those should not be overlooked. We should be looking into ways to solve that.
Yeah, I completely agree. So the next topic was humanitarian issues.
When these ships are being dismantled, the people dismantling them are in really bad conditions. So they're dismantling potentially toxic metals, and there's toxic emissions, and they're not being given masks. They're in dangerous conditions, and they're not given enough, what is it called, compensation for these risks that they're taking, or safety gear for that matter.
So the last and potentially most pertinent issue I want to talk about with these shipyards is the corruption in the oil industry. So as we mentioned earlier, there are international rules which mandate that you cannot send ships to be and oil rigs to be dismantled in this shipyard because of the terrible conditions. They need to be dismantled in an EU-approved shipyard. However, of course, because the oil industry knows they can get more money if they sell it to these corrupt and very unfriendly and unenvironmentally friendly and human right abusing shipyards, they get more money. And so therefore they exploit loopholes to be able to send their ships to these places. So I guess the main loophole that they use is they sell it to a cash buyer, such as GMS. Of course, I'll link that in the show notes. And then the GMS, not bound by these rules, sells them on to these shipyards, which treat workers badly and release toxic materials into the ocean. And as always, it is just so saddening to see how corrupt the oil industry is and how profit-driven and just how terrible as companies they all are in all these things that they're doing. It really makes me quite sad. So on that rather somber tone, I'd like to wrap up this episode all about global supply chains. Thank you for listening to Fighting Failure, and we'll see you in the next episode all about hydrogen.